This is the Best of Mike and Mike podcast on ESPNRadio.com. The Best of Mike and Mike.
Hey, it's Greeny. Thank you for checking out the Best of Mike and Mike podcast. What we have for you today, plenty on the passing of Dean Smith, including unforgettable reaction from Roy Williams and Charlie Scott. Plus our reaction to a letter written by the New York Knicks owner James Dolan and Brian Hoyer on the troubles in Cleveland and his future plans. Sports icons, true legends of the game that we play, where when they die, in the first sentence of their life story, we talk about anything other than their sport. But Dean Smith is that exception. One of the greatest coaches of all time in any sport, without question, the titles, the Final Fours, all the stars that he sent to the next level. But with Dean Smith, it will always be about a lot more than that. It'll be about his courage, his sense of what was right at a time when that was not popular or easy. We will get to both of those in just a few minutes, but we'll start, Mike, with all the basketball games that he won and all the basketball players that he coached. He is without question in the pantheon of the greatest coaches and legendary figures in the history of American sports.
Well, I think you said it correctly when you start to talk about somebody with the words of what they did off the court and what they meant to the, forgetting college basketball, the world of sports, what he was known for. Remember, he coached the '76 Olympic team as well. I mean, he's a guy that's so renowned, and I think the key thing is so well respected for what he had done and some of his accomplishments that go beyond numbers that we're going to get into, obviously, with guys like Charlie Scott and the meaning behind a lot of that. So, again, we'll list accomplishments, and you're in awe of accomplishments and a string that he had at North Carolina where for 36 years his only losing record was his first year when I believe he was 8-9, and only 5 times in those 36 years did he hit double-digit losses. I mean, the numbers, we'll go over them, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen them. But for those of you that haven't, it's just amazing what he has done numbers-wise, but what he has done to influence players that that's played under him. And the coaching tree, the coaching tree has a lot of branches going out as well. So he has touched a lot of people's lives, both on the court and off, and many, if they could heed the words he used to teach them, went on to have very, very successful lives of their own, whether it was on the court, whether it was off the court, whether it was coaching or not.
No, I mean, the phrase "the Carolina way" is one of those that permeates all through basketball. Play smart, play hard, play together. That's the Carolina way, and that came from Dean Smith. And one of the things I heard someone say as I was driving in this morning was that today in basketball gyms all across the world, people will be teaching things that Dean Smith created, even though they don't know that. They don't know that they're teaching something that Dean Smith created, but it came from him. And if you actually look back at his life, he played for Fog Allen at Kansas, who played for James Naismith.
Yeah.
So Dr. James Naismith invented the game, who then taught it to Fog Allen, one of the legendary figures, who then taught it to Dean Smith, who, by the way, lettered in 3 sports in high school. I learned a lot of things about Dean Smith I didn't know yesterday. He was a quarterback in high school. He was a catcher in baseball. He was a basketball player at Kansas, and, of course, went on to become one of the winningest and most celebrated and as you said, most beloved and respected figures in all of college sports. Among those reacting yesterday, Roy Williams, who was his longtime assistant. Roy Williams recruited Michael Jordan to North Carolina. Then Roy Williams went on to great success, of course, at Kansas, was lured back to North Carolina the second time that they begged him to come back, and has won 2 championships, and, of course, is the coach there now. And he was, as you would expect, emotional yesterday, talking about the man who gave him everything he has.
Coach Smith's legacy is hard to put it in perspective because it's so huge. It's wide-ranging from everything. I think he's the best I've ever seen on the court, and he was 100 times better off the court. And his dealing with people and the loyalty that he showed to his school and his players, nobody can ever match.
We'll talk to Roy today, 9 o'clock Eastern here on Mike and Mike.
You know one of the biggest, I think it's been lost a bit. I'm sure it still happens, but we don't use the word, is today coaches coach, but with Dean Smith and that time, they taught. Yeah. There's a difference. You teach somebody the game, you teach them aspects of the game, and now today it's called more coaching. I do think there is a difference. And listen, that's not to downgrade the coaching of today. The game certainly is different when you're only getting guys in there for a year, maybe two. You just got to coach them because you're going to lose them. You don't have time to teach them because by the time you teach them, they're gone. So the times have helped that change, and it's not to say every coach today doesn't do some teaching. But you hear that term a lot less. And with him, you heard that 90% of the time. He coached the team, but he taught as well. He was a great teacher of the game.
He was extraordinarily revered by a number of people, including those he competed against, like Mike Krzyzewski, who was talking about him yesterday. I actually heard on the all-night show they were talking about that time in the 80s. And there was that time in the 80s when Valvano won at NC State, and Coach K brought Duke to a level of prominence that it had not had for a while. And so in the mid-'80s, you really had three top-level. You're talking about nationally elite programs. Duke was a championship-caliber program by the mid-'80s. Carolina was in the Final Four, it felt like, every year in the 80s, and then Valvano wins a national championship. Right. So that group, and now, sadly, two of the three of them are no longer with us. The one who is, of course, Mike Krzyzewski.
Well, Dean set the highest of standards in our profession, and will go down as one of the great coaches of any sport at all time, because he not only coached the game at the highest level, but he lived the game at the highest level. A man of great principle. You can judge him not just by his wins, but by the loyalty that his former players have for him. They absolutely revere Dean, and he made men of them, not just championship-level basketball players. And I consider him a great, great friend, and it's a privilege to coach against him and become his friend.
Well, that's the thing. He made men of them. I mean, again, this isn't talked about as much anymore, and it's because of the way the game is and where we are in college basketball. So it's not fair, I think, to put that on a lot of coaches of today, but of what the expectation was as a coach when he started coaching way back when. As to how you help your players, because you have your players most of the time a little longer than you have them today, and what you're able to teach them, because his lists of accomplishments off the court, when we start to get into those, are as long or longer than the list of accomplishments that are on the court. It's pretty incredible.
We're Mike and Mike, presented by Progressive Insurance. You can test drive Snapshot to see how much you could save before switching to Progressive. Visit progressive.com/snapshot. If you look, at the time that Dean Smith retired, he was the winningest men's basketball coach of all time. He has since been surpassed by Bob Knight, by Mike Krzyzewski, and also by Jim Boeheim, who yesterday was remembering the man that he competed against for so long and for so well on a variety of occasions. And I've got Boeheim for you here someplace. Where did I lose my Jim Boeheim soundbite? Here it is.
Well, Dean Smith is an icon among coaches. He established so many things that we all do today, so many different things that he did for the first time, helped to revolutionize college basketball. One of the great, great coaches of all time, and established North Carolina as one of the great programs for college basketball.
You said it earlier, and you were right. There are things that coaches teach now or coach on the court that they may, but certainly the players they're coaching don't realize where it came from, and maybe some coaches don't even know the full tree of where it all came from.
I would guess that there are high school basketball coaches who have no idea that they're coaching something that was originated with Dean Smith, and who knows? Again, Smith learned it from Allen, and Allen learned it from Naismith, and that's where the game began. So, there is a direct link back to the origins of the game itself involving Dean Smith. And I'll tell you, they call the arena, the basketball arena in Chapel Hill, is called the Dean Dome. And as I think you know, and certainly many in our audience know, my son became a huge Carolina basketball fan about 4 or 5 years ago, as soon as he was old enough to understand the game. And so we went down there. I took him to a game once. And there is a museum attached to the Dean Dome where they've got like all kinds of, it's huge. They've got a lot of history there. And it's if you ever get a chance, if you should just happen to be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is a beautiful place to be, by the way, right next to you, there's the basketball arena, which is like the size of Madison Square Garden. It holds like 20,000 people. It's colossal. And then there is the aquatic center. Mm-hmm. So your daughter would appreciate that. They got like the swimming and diving center. And then there's the basketball museum. And it's got unbelievable stuff, including, and I saw it on Twitter yesterday, someone tweeted it out, but it's got like a little display dedicated to the recruitment of Michael Jordan. So it's got the letter that Dean Smith wrote to Michael Jordan and to his parents in 1980, recruiting him to come play there, a pair of sneakers that Jordan wore, all kinds of stuff. It's an amazing thing, and I'm sure many of the big-time college programs have that sort of thing. Does Notre Dame have like a football museum? There's so much football history.
I mean, they have an area in known as the ACC, to me, of it just kind of goes through the history of all sports, but nothing just for football.
Okay,
no.
yeah. I mean, this is literally a museum. It is like it's like you're walking into an art museum, except all of the art is pictures of basketball stars going back. I mean, even before the 60s, I would guess. But, from Michael Jordan to before Michael Jordan, Bob McAdoo and all those kind of eras before that. It's an amazing thing, and you realize just how long this was going on. I mean, Dean Smith was the coach there from the early 60s all the way through the late 80s. And into the late 90s, excuse me, the late 90s.
61 to 97.
They won the – I mean, he won the year Chris Webber called the timeout. Dean Smith won the championship. He's on the floor then. So, I mean, he spanned a long period of time, and you were right. He got out right before a time when coaches stopped being able to have the influence, through no fault of theirs, that they had in his day. If you talk to guys like Billis, you talk to guys who played for coaches for 3 or 4 years, the legendary coaches, and they will tell you. Jerry Stackhouse was telling a story yesterday about how he would still send his financial statements to Dean Smith every month, for years and years and years after his career. Jay Billis has told me many times there isn't a significant decision he has made in his life that he hasn't bounced off Mike Krzyzewski before he makes it. That's the relationship these guys had with their coaches, because they had them when they were still kids. I mean, they're still boys in some ways, and helps them become men. Now, no matter how hard these guys try, when you're there for 1 year, it just isn't the same thing.
You don't build that relationship. You absolutely don't build it. It's much more difficult. And you think about the relationships he built here from – the coaching tree of Roy Williams to Bill Guthridge to Matt Doherty to George Carl to Larry Brown, Eddie Fogler, Billy Cunningham, Mitch Kupchak. I mean, it's just incredible.
Well, those are his guys. I mean, Guthridge and Doherty, succeeded him there. Doherty was one of his players. Doherty was on the Jordan National Championship team. Guthridge was his longtime assistant who succeeded him immediately and actually made a Final Four. Doherty went there and it didn't work at all. Remember, he was the coach at Notre Dame for like 1 year, went to Carolina, it didn't work. Mm-hmm. That's when they first begged Roy, and Roy came back and resurrected everything. But Roy was his guy. Carl played for him.
Who else
are we talking about? Larry Brown played for him. Billy Cunningham played for him, won a title as a head coach in the NBA with the Sixers. Who else did you say?
I said Mitch Kupchak.
Kupchak, of course, now runs the Lakers. And I mean, the list goes on and on. Bob McAdoo played for him. He's been an assistant coach forever. I mean, the number of great players that played for him, Worthy and Sam Perkins, and I mean, the list is almost endless. Anton Jameson played for him. All those guys that played for him for years and years and years.
And all that
Rasheed Wallace.
All that said, one of the great things he was noted for, I'm so happy, was thrown out of basketball.
The four corners.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The four corners, for those not old enough to remember, when they got a lead of about 8 points with about 10 minutes left.
I mean, forget it. He was the king of the four corner, and finally, thank God they got rid of it. I think it was in 85.
They put in the shot clock.
The shot clock, and thank God for that. So something he did that I couldn't stand led to something we all see now in the shot clock, and thank God for that, because that four corners I just
he would take the air out of the ball. I mean, they would literally just go
yes.
into an offense that was designed to just run the clock basically out.
Yep. And they were good at it.
And they were very good at it. And they won a lot of games doing it. And then they put the shot clock in, and they won a lot of games doing that, too. I still think that one of the greatest games ever, and it's hard to say what was the individual greatest college basketball game ever. If I had to pick one greatest college basketball game ever, it would probably be Duke and Kentucky that ends on the Leitner shot that puts Duke into the Final Four, and whatever year that was, 91, 92, something like that. But right up there is the championship game that Jordan winds up winning with the shot, and Fred Brown throws the ball away. Carolina, Georgetown. Ewing is a freshman. Jordan is a freshman. Yeah. James Worthy was on that team. Sam Perkins was on that team.
I was obviously watching a ton of it yesterday. Everybody was expecting either Perkins or most notably Worthy to take the shot, and here you go, kid. Take the ball, hit the 15-foot jumper, ball game.
And then Fred Brown throws the ball away to James Worthy, which is a shame that it ends on that. But if I had to pick the 5 best college basketball games I've ever seen. I go back, that would be fairly early in my tenure. We're watching it. It still hurts me to see it.
See, Fred,
it still hurts to watch it.
It does. It does. To watch him throw that ball away is just incredible.
It's what a shame that game ended that way. If I remember correctly, we could look this up. I think Patrick Ewing goaltended on the first 4 Carolina baskets.
I remember that like it was yesterday, watching him just make his presence known, giving up points along the way. I grant you that, but he was basically saying not up in here. I certainly remember.
It's one of the greatest games of all time. But as I opened by saying, with Dean Smith, if all you do is talk about the basketball, then you are unquestionably missing among the most important parts, if not the most important part of the story.
The best of Mike and Mike.
Charlie Scott today, and that is the guest I'm really most looking forward to. Because when you talk about Dean Smith, if you talk about the 900-plus wins, and you talk about the 2 championships, and you talk about all the Final Fours and the Sweet 16s, and even the players that he turned into pros, you're really not getting the whole story. Dean Smith graduated 96% of his players. Still not getting the whole story. Here comes the story. In 1964, Dean Smith and a local pastor sat in a popular Chapel Hill restaurant called The Pines with a black North Carolina student. When they were asked to leave, Dean Smith refused. The incident helped integrate the restaurant. With Smith's increasing popularity in the state due to his success on the court, the event became an important landmark in the state during the Civil Rights Movement. 4 years later, Dean Smith recruited Charlie Scott, the first black player in North Carolina history. He played 3 seasons starting in the 67-68 season. He'll join us live this morning, Charlie Scott. 1 year, and I regret that I don't remember what year it was, they gave Dean Smith an award at the ESPYs, and I was there. And I will admit to my total embarrassment that I did not know anything about that history at that time. I was a young sportscaster. This had to be in the late 90s that they gave him this award at the ESPYs. So I was a 31, 32-year-old sportscaster, and it was 1998. Thank you. So I was 31 years old. I was at ESPN for 1 year, and I will confess, I knew all about the wins.
Yeah.
I knew Michael Jordan. I knew James Worthy. I remember just the very end of Bob McAdoo and guys like that. But I didn't know about Charlie Scott. I did not know the influential force that Dean Smith was behind integrating the Atlantic Coast Conference and the struggle that was at the time and the resistance that he met at the time and the significance of that at the time to everyone and to the game of basketball. I didn't know anything about it, but I learned about it that night, and I've since read a great deal about it. And if you haven't read about it, to use a newfangled expression, Google it. Because what you will find is that what Dean Smith accomplished in his life, particularly in that time and then on from then, was about a lot more than just 4 corners and about a lot more than just winning basketball games. Dean Smith was one of those people in the world of sports who made the world a better place by what he stood for. And again, there are a lot of great coaches and a lot of guys who won a lot of games. There weren't a lot of guys like Dean Smith.
And you're not obligated to do that either. You're there to coach. Certainly there are different times, but he went outside his safe zone of coaching and decided to, he wanted to be a guy that this is the way he lived. And I'm sure he learned it growing up as well, that it wasn't just all about sports, that he went outside the world of sports just with all the things Greeny mentioned. And I'm with you. I didn't know them either when I had no idea about this. So it was incredible to learn. And not that just he brought in Charlie Scott, but what he did, in the restaurant, and how many times he was approached to run for the U.S. Senate seat in North Carolina as well, because people saw his influence and wanted him to be more and to even try and do more. But here's a guy that obviously taught on the court, from a coaching tree to players that went on to have great careers, but were turned out to be some pretty good guys as well. Certainly, he never hit 100% in everything. But what he did off the court in times when, you weren't even born when this was going on. I was too young to know what was going on. I was 2 years old back in '64 when he sat in that restaurant. So it's that I would say is the big thing. The numbers are easy to see, the greatness from numbers, but dig a little deeper into what Dean Smith meant off the court as well.
The best of Mike and Mike.
Mike and Mike.
best of Mike and Mike.
Mike and Mike.
It is our pleasure to welcome on the Subway Feshtag hotline right now Charlie Scott, who was a terrific guard at North Carolina in the late 60s. And when he was recruited to the campus at Chapel Hill by Dean Smith, he became, in 1966, the first African-American scholarship athlete in North Carolina's history and the first great African-American player in the history of the Atlantic Coast Conference. And that story was told on a night that they honored Dean Smith in the late 90s at the ESPYs. And I sat in awe and watched and listened to the stories and had to confess at that time, at the age of 31, that I didn't know anything about that part of Dean Smith's history or Charlie Scott's. But the moment that we heard that we had lost Dean Smith over the weekend, the first thought I had was we need to talk to Charlie Scott this morning. So, Charlie, Mike and Mike, it is our pleasure to have you this morning, and our condolences on the passing of Dean Smith, and we hope that you were well this morning. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. Coach Smith meant a lot to me, but he meant a lot to all 300 players who played for him. So I hope I can do justice for all those who have come in contact with him.
Well, I'd love it if you could, for our audience, Charlie, and maybe for generations of people in our audience who couldn't really fully understand what the world was like at the time that you and Dean Smith came together in the late 60s. Can you explain a little bit about what that period of time was like and your initial interaction with Dean Smith and what it was like when you first came to play for him at Carolina?
Well, things that people, I think, lose sight of is that the biggest thing in the South that blacks had to endure was the fear of just living in the South. When you live in a part of the country whereas if you talk to somebody wrong, you could be hanged. If you looked at somebody wrong, you could be hanged. People could take away all your civil liberties without any justice being done to them. I mean, it was a era where people in the South fear for their life. Blacks fear for their life. And that is a very hard way to live. Fortunately, I mean, I grew up in New York, but when I went to the South, I found a different society and a different style of living. And it was an adjustment that was a culture shock and made it really something that I thought I understood. But being in the South in the 60s made it a whole different situation for me, and it's something that I had to really adjust to.
So if you could, can you talk about the conversations that you had with Dean Smith about all of that?
Well, to be honest with you, Mike, the biggest thing that Coach Smith did was that he didn't talk to me about that. I tell people the greatest thing that Coach Smith did for me, because everybody always asks me, what did Coach Smith do with you being the first black athlete? He did nothing with me different than he did with the other athletes. And that is what made me feel comfortable, because he treated me no differently than he treated the other players. And for a black man in the South at that time to be treated like a white person, that was all that you ever wanted to happen. And that in itself was the biggest thing that Coach Smith did for me. He treated me no different than he treated every other player on that team.
Mike and Charlie Scott is with us this morning sharing his recollections of Dean Smith. Just to give, again, folks, an idea of what the world was like, your junior and senior years, you were widely considered to be the best player in your conference. You were not given the Player of the Year honor in either of those 2 seasons, passed over both times. Did Coach Smith ever say anything to you about that?
Well, those were probably times, and Coach Smith would say something, and he made it very clear to me that he did not feel like it was justice done. And it was something that I always knew that Coach Smith always backed me. He always backed all of his players, and he always made us feel that, he had our back and he felt for us anything that injustice that we dealt with. And those were 2 years that really gave me it was one of the very few times that when I played basketball that I felt that I had been slighted, and that it was a slight that was dealt directly on bigotry.
Is there a point when you left North Carolina and went on to play professionally, or even a couple years after leaving, then a decade, then a couple of decades after, did your thought process change on just what Dean Smith did for you and meant for you as a player and a person?
Well, when you're in school and when you play for Coach Smith, he's your coach, he's your teacher, and he's your disciplinarian. That's what he is when you were in school. When you graduated, Coach Smith became my friend, my father figure, my mentor. And that transformation is the transformation that not only went on with me, but with every player who played for Coach Smith. Once you leave there as an athlete, you become a son to him, where he wants to do all he can to enhance your life, to make sure that you are being a viable person in society, that you are impactful and that you feel like you have something, a contribution to make to life. And he's always there. And the thing about it, which people don't understand, is that Coach Smith just didn't do this for me or for Michael or for James Worthy or for Phil Ford. He did it for the players that never played professional basketball. He did it for the Dick Grubauers, and he did it for the Jim Delaney's, and he did it for the Joe Browns, the people that you never hear of. But he was impactful in their life, really probably much more than he was impactful with ours, because we went on to play professional sports. These guys that I talk about didn't play professional sports, but Coach Smith cared just as much for the 15th player, for the manager, and their life as he cared for what I did in life.
Charlie Scott is with us, good enough to share some of his memories on this day. And I guess I would wrap it up with this, Charlie. When everyone throughout the sports world knew that he had been ill in recent years and had been fading to some degree. But when you heard the word, however it is you heard the word recently, the last day or two, that he had actually died, what were the first thoughts that you had?
Well, my thoughts was very selfish. I mean, I knew he was sick, and when I had been around, I had seen him, and we knew that he was going through this stage in life. But when someone passes that you care so much for, you become selfish, because I will miss just the comfort of able to being around him, being able to go see him. Those things are the things that really, being selfish, I will miss. I mean, I knew he was sick. I had been around him. I had gone to see him a couple of months earlier, and he was going through a stage that, that we go through at that stage in life. But just the idea that I could put my arms around him, that I could hug him, that I could tell him that I loved him, I will miss being able to do that more than anything else.
The best of Mike and Mike.
When you talk about Dean Smith, pretty much everyone can recite. Yeah, he won the 2 national championships, all the Final Fours, all the Sweet 16s, all the great players that he coached that went on to Hall of Fame careers in the NBA, going back, Bob McAdoo and Phil Ford and Michael Jordan and James Worthy, and the list goes on and on. Everyone pretty much knows all that about Dean Smith. But the Charlie Scott part of Dean Smith and all of the other areas in which he made a difference, stuff that mattered every bit as much as being a basketball coach, that was stuff that not everybody knew, and I'm thrilled we were able to bring that part of it to this conversation.
Completely agree.
Let's put the two together with someone who knew him about as well as anyone could know him, his longtime assistant, who is now himself a member of the Basketball Hall of Fame and has won 2 national championships as the head coach at North Carolina. Our friend Roy Williams is with us on the Subway Fresh Take Hotline. Coach Roy, good morning. Mike and Mike, how are you today?
Good, Mike. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
There we go. I like the music, but I could barely hear what you were saying there, but I heard a little bit about what you said about Charlie, and that's the thing. I mean, needless to say, I think he's the greatest coach ever on the court, but yet he was far, far better as a human being and as a concerned person and a person that cared for others. He was far greater off the court than he was on the court, and I really believe that from the bottom of my soul.
Now, let's talk a little bit about that side of Dean Smith, because as I've read about him this weekend, I realized that it was not just in integrating the Atlantic Coast Conference and that stand that he took, but a lot of other political stands and stands on social issues that he took over the course of time that you don't usually see people in his position take, because those are issues that will divide people, and then there are people that will be turned off by his doing that. What was it about him that made him feel that he needed to do those things?
Well, part of it was probably from his background. His mother and father, both school teachers, and I think his father helped integrate the basketball program at the high school in Kansas, maybe 100 years ago. I don't know exactly when it was, but it was a long time. But his family background and his concern for people probably started right there. I mean, when I got to know him, I was a freshman here in 1968-69 playing on the freshman team, and he would walk by and I would just stand there with my mouth hanging wide open kind of thing. But it was the concern for people, trying to help people. I mean, the things that he did here in the university, is just phenomenal. I mean, he was always big in trying to help out the School of Social Work. He came to me one time and said he just did something really good, and I said, what was that? And he said he helped a scholarship program at the School of Education, and he told them to find young Roy Williamses out there and help them become educators. He thought of himself as a teacher, and I think that he taught on the court. Yes, the court was his classroom, but he taught off the court as well, and I think that was more important to him. Somebody asked me last night, did I think that what was his response be if people made a bigger thing of that than his success on the court? And I said, with a smile, I said, then he would feel like he had won. He would feel like he was successful because it wasn't just about points and rebounds.
Because time's certainly different now than then. Can you still have an effect like that he had then?
You know, Michael, it's harder now because there's so many other people around. You know, we used to deal with someone talking about coming to North Carolina, and we deal with their parents. Now you're dealing with people all around them. The culture has every guy from the best seventh grader in the country or whoever that is kind of thing, that there's so many people around them thinking about what might happen down the road that it is really difficult for the coaches to have that effect, but yet we should try, because you never can tell. You may help someone. My high school coach told me one time, said if you coach someone 30 years later, you can still see something you gave them, and you'd better darn well make sure that it's something positive. And, so you do still have that, but not like you did at that time. But Coach took it to the extreme because he really wanted to make sure they understood it was not just how many games we win that was going to determine. He even told me, he said, if we play really well, I can handle the losing. And I said, Coach, that's a battle I'm fighting, because I'm not so sure if I wouldn't just win and whether I played really well or not kind of thing. And yet I try to do those things all the time. I'm not even close. I mean, he really said it, and he really meant it and believed it.
Mike, Roy Williams is with us. Where did the Carolina way come from?
Came from him. There's no question. When Frank McGuire was here, and Frank had the Underground Railroad from New York supposedly here, and had all those guys, and he built the legacy of winning, and they won a national championship in 1957. I was 7 years old. Neither one of you guys were born at that time, but Coach McGuire hired Coach Smith as an assistant, and Coach loved Coach McGuire. But he wanted more, and then when he was asked to stay on and be the head coach when Coach McGuire left, and there was some probationary status here, and he fought through some tough times. They hung him in effigy after a loss one year, but for him it was the big picture. It was not just about winning games; it was the big picture, and his activities on the social front. He felt like as a basketball coach that maybe you shouldn't try to use that position, but he adamantly wanted to let people know where he stood, and it was a difficult fight for him all the time. But when it was the civil rights issue, it was not a fight for him at all, because it was the right thing to do. And I think that's the thing that stands out about him more than anything, is Carolina Way was the right thing to do every single day, whether people were watching you or not.
So many things stand out from the teachings of Dean Smith, both on the court and off. Do one or two ring more to you than others, or are more that you use more than others of his teachings?
Yeah, I think so. It's the one thing he always told me is that, on the court, do what's best for the team, but off the court, do what's best for the individual. We've had 13 youngsters leave here early for the NBA draft since I came back, and it's never bothered me because it was the right thing for them to do. Some I was worried about more than others, to say the least, because there's different levels of first-round picks. First pick is a lot better than the 30th pick, but always be concerned about the individual off the court. And then the other thing is, coaching is what you guys do as well, is trying to get everybody to buy in to get the best at the end. And so everyone has to make sacrifices. You've got to have a guy who's a great screener and make him feel like that's really, really important. And you have a guy that may be a great rebounder. It's got to be really, really important. The guy who's not a good shooter, make him be realistic and don't take shots, some of those kind of things. But it's, to me, more about the individual was the one thing, and then the second thing is building a team requires very gifted people to make sacrifices.
Mike Roy Williams is now the coach at North Carolina. It's well known that Dean Smith maintained an office there in the Dean Dome. It's not far from your office there in the building. And up until, to my knowledge, at least fairly recently, he was there regularly. But it had been known for a while that he had been in failing health. What were these last few years like?
They were difficult. I still remember my first 4 or 5 years, the little notes left on my desk or the phone call after every game. And I really miss that. I really do. And yet, the last few years have been really hard. He would still come by the office and have lunch with his former secretary, and we would go stop by and see him or see the van parked out front and hope you had a chance. And he wasn't as responsive as he wanted to be, and it was really difficult because he was a very, very proud man. And yet, this is I've been trying to prepare myself for this moment for the last 5 or 6 years, and I thought I had. But the bottom line is you can't be prepared.
I guess, Roy, as a final thought, we so appreciate your time on what we know was a tough day. If you had to try, and I know it's not easy to do, to sum up what Dean Smith meant to college basketball in his lifetime, how would you do it?
Well, I don't have enough time because he was a leader. He was an innovator. People point at the passer in the NBA and WNBA to thank them for the pass. They huddle at the free throw line. They stand up when a teammate comes out. I go to high school games, and every player on the bench stands up when a substitute comes out of the game. But the biggest thing is that he cared. And I hope, and I'll never do it to the degree that Coach did it, but I hope when I stop that people will say I cared. And Coach Smith cared about the game and about the players more than anybody I've ever known.
Mike and Mike.
I'm really surprised by this. A fellow by the name of Aaron Bierman wrote a letter to James Dolan, the owner of the Knicks, in which he writes, I have been a Knicks fan since 1952. At one stage, I thought you did a wonderful thing when you acquired everything from your dad. However, since then, it has been all downhill. You're working with Isaiah Thomas and everything else regarding the Knicks. Bringing on Phil Jackson was a positive beginning, but lowballing Steve Kerr was a disgrace to the Knicks. The bottom line is that you merely continue to interfere with the franchise. As a Knicks fan for in excess of 60 years, I'm utterly embarrassed by your dealings with the Knicks. Sell them so their fans can at least look forward to growing them in a positive direction. Obviously, money is not the only thing. You have done a lot of utterly stupid business things with the franchise. Please no more. Respectfully, Aaron Bierman's dad. That's a note that was written to James Dolan. That's certainly not the nicest note anyone has ever written.
Someone who is
a
disgruntled, longtime fan of the Knicks.
I would have to believe. Now, I don't. I do not have any way of putting a number on it. I have to believe hundreds of these come in every day.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. I know you and I get at least dozens of nasty notes every single day.
And we try and hide them from you all the time.
So James Dolan wrote back, and it has been confirmed it was him. Mr. Bierman, you are a sad person. Why would anybody write such a hateful letter? I am just guessing, but I'll bet your life is a mess and you are a hateful mess. What have you done that anyone would consider positive or nice? I am betting nothing. In fact, I'll bet you are a negative force in everyone who comes in contact with you. You most likely have made your family miserable. Alcoholic, maybe. I just celebrated my 21-year anniversary of sobriety. You should try it. Maybe it will help you become a person that folks would like to have around. In the meanwhile, start rooting for the Nets because the Knicks don't want you. Respectfully, James Dolan.
Wow.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?
And that's the proverbial killing the fly with the sledgehammer. I mean, what are you doing?
That is taking direct personal attacks upon a person who identifies himself as a fan and a 50-year supporter of your franchise because he dared to write a letter criticizing your ownership style, which, by the way, has been criticized by everyone paying attention for 15 years, if not beyond. The person who did so did not do so in any personal way, and these are personal attacks up to and including accusing a person of being an alcoholic that you've never met and don't know anything about. If an NBA player wrote this, that NBA player would probably be suspended, at minimum fined. And I'll say this to Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, who I hope that we will see later this week at the All-Star game. If they don't do anything to James Dolan after this, who has acknowledged, his people have acknowledged he wrote it, then that is hypocritical. Because if an NBA player wrote that email, he would at minimum, or said these things to a fan at a game, at minimum be fined.
Be fined, right.
And probably be suspended. And if the owner isn't, then that's baloney. And so that's on the commissioner. And I'm waiting to hear what they do with the owner of the Knicks.
The best of Mike and Mike.
Mike and Mike.
Changing the topic, it's our pleasure to welcome back to the program a guy who had himself a really good year and now finds himself with what will probably be a whole lot of options during this offseason from the Cleveland Browns, at least for the time being. Quarterback Brian Hoyer is with us on Mike and Mike. How have you been, Brian?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Doing well. We are well. Before we get into any of the specifics of now, I'd love to just take a big picture look. I remember we had you on last year during the training camp and then on into the early parts of the preseason, and you were talking about your expectations for the year, and all the talk at that time was about Manziel and will he take your job and all of that. And you look back at a year that had a lot of really high moments and then a few that weren't as high. How do you assess this football season and your performance in particular in Cleveland?
Yeah, you're right. We had some ups and downs, and things were going really well for us, and we hit a rough patch. And I think everybody else knows how the season went after that. So it was disappointing the way we finished. I think we made progress as far as the Cleveland Browns are concerned. Coach Penn did a great job of coming in and starting to change that culture a little bit. And obviously, at one point we were 7-4. I mean, if you had told me our season would end the way it did at that point, I would have said you're crazy. But with injuries and things like that, which everybody has to deal with, we just, had a few rough games and played some good teams and didn't finish the way we would have liked.
So then for you personally, when at the end of the season Manziel takes over for you and then he gets injured and Connor Shaw actually finishes the season. So when that season ends and everybody's kind of packing their lockers, when you're doing that, are you thinking you're packing your locker in Cleveland for the last time?
Yeah, I mean, you don't know. You really don't know how things are gonna play out. And for me, my entire career has kind of been that way. Not drafted and then released, and then I was out of football for a little bit. So you never know how things are gonna play out. And obviously, I'm from here. I think the story's been told 100 times, and it would be great for me to stay here. But at the same point, I also have to make the best decision for myself and my family at this point because, as you know, this career doesn't last very long. So. It's all about, doing what is best for you. And obviously I love, playing in Cleveland and I love my teammates and the coaches, and it would be great for me to stay here, but I don't know, where the future is at this point.
And a lot of things, again, we're talking to Brian Hoyer, Cleveland Browns quarterback, have to go into that decision. And one of them is the fact that your offensive coordinator, Kyle Shanahan, and your quarterback coach, Dow Loggins, are both gone. The one was fired, and Shanahan left on his own, and now the reports out of the texting issue between Ray Farmer and it looks like Dow Loggins about personnel, or basically what we all perceive to be, hey, maybe should Johnny be in the game right now over Brian Hoyer? If those are the kinds of texts that were out there, and while those two guys are gone and the GM is still there, where does that go into the equation of do I want to go back to this team or not?
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously there's an ongoing investigation about that right now, and I'm just as interested as everybody else is to figure out, what it was about, because, like you said, when you read the stories, and obviously it's all, rumor and speculation at this point, but if it had something to involve me, I think, I'd like to be able to know what that was. So, I'm just as interested as everyone else is to figure out what, that was.
Mike and Brian Hoyer, the other story that I saw yesterday, but for those in our audience who did not get a chance to hear your comments, was that you were extraordinarily surprised by the news that Johnny Manziel had checked himself into rehab. You were saying you had a group text with the other quarterbacks and all that kind of stuff, and you obviously spent the overwhelming majority of the year around him. For those in our audience who did not get to hear what it is you had to say, what was your reaction when you heard about Johnny?
Yeah, I mean, I was shocked, to hear the news. Being around him, a football season is a long time, and there's long hours and you're together for long periods of time, so to know that he'd gotten to that point was a shock to me. Like I said, we have a group message with all the quarterbacks, and even for a few weeks ago he was taking part in that. So for me, I think it takes a really big person to, especially in his shoes, with how much hype and media surrounds him, to be able to take those steps and realize that he needs the help and put himself in there. I think I have a lot of praise for him, and we became friends throughout the season. I know a lot people want to make us into enemies. I think we really became good friends. And, I always felt like Johnny supported me when I was out there playing, and I did the same when he was playing. So I really hope that he gets what he wants out of it and, gets back out on the field.
And the other guy, of course, in Cleveland there, in the terrible situation with Josh Gordon, who now faces a suspension of at least a season. And he wrote that letter, and Stephen A. and Charles Barkley and all those guys sort of responded. All of us are on the outside. You've been around him to at least some degree. Now, I know that he wasn't allowed to be there that much this year. What can you tell us about Josh Gordon? Because he's a person everyone has an opinion on, and most of the people giving their opinions don't really know him.
Sure. I think, Josh is he's a very quiet guy, but I think he's deep down, he really is a good person. He's really young. He's made some mistakes just like everybody else has. And I think for him, it's on a grander stage, especially with, what he was able to accomplish 2 years ago. I mean, he played 14 games and broke, several records and led the NFL in receiving. So I think there's a lot of expectations out of him. And it's too bad it's gotten to this point, but hopefully, similar to what Johnny's going through, he figures it out and is able to, be on the team and be on the field, because he is capable of doing great things. And it's not just that he's a great football player. I really do think he's a good person too.
Well, the Browns certainly have had an offseason that I think people already don't want to remember. We'll see where it goes, and you'll have, I'm sure you're hoping, choices out there, whether Cleveland's one of them or not.
Is it tampering if I mention the Jets need a quarterback that could use a
No,
veteran?
it's not tampering.
Is that tampering?
No.
I'm just a fan. I'm not an employee.
That's not tampering, and Brian going to be a free agent. He can say whatever he wants, right, Brian?
Yeah, Brian. So, I mean, the Jets, they got an up-and-coming situation. They have a high draft pick. They could draft a good receiver in there. That could be a nice situation.
Sure, I think for me, you know what, at this point, all options are on the table. This is really, as crazy as it is, going into my 7th season, this is the first time I've really been a free agent. So I called my agent, Joe Linton. I'm like, how does this work? Like, when do we start hearing things, and how does that work? And, so I know, from talking to him, we're still about a month away in this process. So for me, really, this has been my first, off time since 2 seasons ago, because leading up to 2 seasons ago, you have training camp, and then I played, and then I got hurt, and I rehabbed all the way up until last season. So I've really taken these, last 4 weeks and really just enjoyed being with my wife and kids, and traveled a little bit, and trying to really take my mind off of it, because I know here in a few weeks it's going to, be time to make some tough decisions.
I also have a feeling Joe's mantra might be "have check, will travel" type of a situation.
Not a bad mantra to have.
This has been the Best of Mike and Mike on ESPN Radio Pod Center. To hear more from Mike and Mike, log on to ESPNradio.com and become an ESPN Radio Insider.
The Best of Mike and Mike.